The point of my teaching is this, is we need to take time to think about why we do what we do. A lot of times I feel like when we go through life, there are moments where we're just simply doing things just to do them. And we can kind of get lost in the noise of wondering, okay, well, why am I doing this specific thing at this specific time? So we're going to be kind of engaging this thought throughout this teaching. There was a Barna study that was done in 2010 that states this: the American church is becoming more ingrown and less outreach-oriented. Once again, the American church is becoming more ingrown and less outreach-oriented. So I want to take a moment to ask you, what do you think is causing this to happen to the American church? And you can spit out just like bullet pointing, so it doesn't have to be super long and profound. We can have a few people respond.
This like new trend of social media making it more identity, like inward focused.
Okay, so social media. That definitely has an impact, yeah. Consumerism, oh yeah. Raphael talked about that in his message, and I was commenting that, yeah, that has a really big impact, not only on the way that we think, but our theology too sometimes too, and it can be dangerous. Yeah.
Like American egocentrism?
Yeah. Individualism, right? Yeah. It's all about me, and I need to do whatever I can do just for me so I can benefit me, and forget about whoever I stomp on, forget about whoever's in my tracks. It's all about me.
I think there's people pleasing for those that are already within your church.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
instead of creating change, you're reacting to what's going on.
Yeah. So like the politics of church sometimes?
Yeah.
People pleasing. Yeah. Very good. So all these answers are really good, and no matter what your personal viewpoint is on this issue, the thing is that we're responsible for this. We're responsible for our church. And if we say that we follow Christ and we're telling the world, hey, this is what Christ valued, Christ loved God, Christ loved neighbor, if this is affecting the way that we are presenting Christ to people, something else is wrong. So what we see in Mark 2:17 is this, that the church is supposed to be an outward-focused ministry. On hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So if this trend is valid in our churches, I'm not saying every single church is this way, but just a general trend, once again, we're responsible for this. So we have to start thinking about what is happening. So the goal of this teaching today is to help you evaluate what is shaping our church communities, aiming to form our liturgies that lead us to Christ-likeness in our communities, and not simply to us, but to the societies around them, which I would say is the most important. We're going to go ahead and start looking at that. So we're going to be reading out of 1 Corinthians 11:17 through 22. And Paul states this to the Corinthian church. In the following directives I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more harm than good. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you. And to some extent, I believe it. Yikes. No doubt there has to be differences among you to show which of you have God's approval. So then when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat. But when you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, one person remains hungry and another gets drunk. Look at that. One person remains hungry and another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? You're making fun of the poor. What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not in this matter. So I'm going to set the stage up for you for what's actually happening here in 1 Corinthians. So in the context of what is happening, Paul is, even just in general to the letter of 1 Corinthians, Paul is discussing issues within the Corinthian community. And just like many of the other biblical writers, the letters that they're writing kind of like as like a brother or friend to a dear community saying, hey, I want to address this issue because this is happening to you. And throughout 1 Corinthians, you read of division over community readers. You read of issues with lawsuits, a case of sexual immorality, marriage, singleness, and even spiritual gifts and love and more. But at the beginning of the whole book, we see this idea that, similar to what Raph said and others, that the church was divided over its leadership. One wanted to follow this person because I guess they like that person, or one wanted to serve this person because they ministered to them better than the other, I guess. We're not sure. But having that kind of context going on in the first chapter sets up what we see now. If they were divided in their church leadership in general, then why is it a surprise to us that they're divided over sharing the meal with each other? There's divisions going down. And so what was happening was that their practices were not lining up with the Christ-like praxis they were to embody when taking the communal meal. Now, when we think about communion, it's sometimes, at least the way that I thought about it growing up in the American church, it doesn't line up with what we see contextually, or at least what was happening in the First Corinthians. So when thinking of our present-day church experience, we think of like we're all together in a room, everyone gets like a little wafer of crackers, or maybe you grew up in a tradition where there was a common cup and there was a priest and they would serve it to you. But when we think about communion in 1 Corinthians, communion was something that was kind of just added on to a communal meal. So it's like if we just all went to Chick-fil-A, we all had Chick-fil-A sandwiches. Okay, by the way, too, on top, let's break bread. Let's remember what Christ did. Let's also drink together. It was common. It wasn't something that was kind of structured in the way that we think of it now. And so when we think of communion, it was celebrated like this. So in the Corinthian culture and the Greco-Roman culture specifically, this is what was called the triclinium, or what we think of as the dining room. And what people would do is that 9 people would sit across these couches and they would lounge together. And what this model didn't show, but in other models you can see, there would usually be the dining table right here. But what was happening is that in the triclinium, and even in that culture, only the people that were connected with the host would eat eat in this area, this nice padded, cushiony, really awesome, soft, nice place to eat. But there was obviously more than just 9 people in those local churches. And what Richard Hayes, who is a commentator on 1 Corinthians, he states that what may have been happening is that the freedmen, the slaves, the people that weren't directly connected to the host or were just socially separated because of rich value, economic status, whatever, they were forced to eat outside. So this place would usually actually be covered, but those people would literally have to eat outside, get rained on, whatever was going down, and they would be separated. And if that's true, then what Paul is stating is that those people weren't even getting food. Like, they weren't even eating, while all the people were in here reveling and getting drunk. So what does that say about how they were practicing the Lord's Supper? Listen to what Hayes says. I think this is so crazy. In villas where the Corinthians lived, guests of higher status obviously would be served better food in the dining room, while others would sit and stand in the atrium. The host of a normally higher status would be invited to dine, while lower status members placed outside. Paul appeals to the tradition of the Jesus institution of the meal in order to highlight Jesus' death and to remind the Corinthians that they are to remember him when they eat together. This memory should halt their selfish behavior. And when Paul calls for here, it's more than just simply in word. Okay, Paul, we are going to include them in the meal, or we're gonna, they're gonna still stay in the atrium, and they're gonna eat there, but we're gonna eat here. No, what Paul is calling for, Richard Hayes says, is that they all come here, no matter what everybody else in society would say. 4 people are eating with you. We don't do that. But Christ's message, Christ's life was a selfless one. We read this in Philippians 2, it was described earlier. All right, so now let's start in discussing liturgy and connecting that into what we see in addressing the American church really quick. So liturgy is defined as the work of the people, from the Greek word liturgia, meaning public work. Frank Sen, who authors Introduction to Christian Liturgy, states, liturgy can thus refer to a public and well-defined ritual. Liturgies are formed to help people experience and embody what is heard in the scriptures. I think this is so important because we're obviously here, some are getting a mammal, some are getting a mat, some are getting an emptive, but I don't think the people in your church have to get a mat, a mammal, or an emptive to understand the message of Christ. They should be able to embody that and know that when they eat of the bread, when they drink of the cup, when people are baptized, when feet are washed, when people are anointed with oil and prayed for. They should understand who Christ is and Christ's message for them when they do that. Our own professor of historical theology, Dr. Zach Tack, you probably had a class with him before, he states, liturgy helps people experience the meta-narrative of the scriptures. So what should our liturgies consist of practically? They should be theocentric, God-centered, Christocentric, Christ-centered, and numerologically centered, Holy Spirit-centered. And that should be centered in our worship instead of anthropocentric, me-centered worship. If the American church is suffering with this, and this, and this, and this, which eventually just leads up to me. I worship me, I look out for me, I do me. Then when we take of the cup, when we take of the bread, we need to shift everyone's focus from here to Christ.
That's good.
And once again, in the midst of all of this, it leads us to then not only remembering Christ's actions, on the cross, remission of sin, forgiveness, but how Christ tenderly cared for the poor and the oppressed, even those people that Paul were talking about in his address. So as we look at this King Hawaiian roll from Publix, or this grape, more than just simply a moment to do what we do every single Sunday, but let this moment that we share together, let it be a moment to model and to take to your congregation. And let it not just end with the grape and the bread, but let it be the way that you reach out to that orphanage down the street. Let it be the way that you minister to that oppressed people group, or the refugee, or the marginalized, different things like that. Let it be something that transforms you. If in Philippians it says that Christ didn't equate himself as equal status with God, but rather humbled himself and became the likeness of a servant to love others, then let this be our daily reminder to do the same. So let's partake together. Lord, we thank you so much once again for this time to think about the importances of why we do what we do. And I just pray that in the midst of all of that, that this would be the center. That, Lord, we would worship you. It's not about us. As much as American culture and society says that, I pray that we would be other-centered, that we would love God, we would love neighbor, and that the way that we worship, the way that we meet together on a Sunday, the stuff that we say in class, the stuff we say in our workplace, it would be shaped and centered on you. We can partake together. Thank you.